Greetings, students. So the last screencast, I got a little cut off at the end. We were just kind of going through and naming the bones, and I just want to emphasize the importance of practice and review. So if you haven't done that coloring packet, I think that's a really good idea, good way to review. But then there's also some links here in the slideshow that you can get, that you can access. And Get Body Smart has some practice quizzes that allows you to, kind of name bones and play around there. Here's a jam and rap about bones. This is just more of an interesting video about where skeletons come from, and it's kind of interesting. For example, the skeletons in our classroom. They've probably been in this building longer than I've been alive. I don't know where they came from, but this kind of talks about, historically how human specimens were sort of acquired for use in educational settings, and it's not it's a little disturbing. So worth watching, I think, kind of interesting. So do whatever you need to do to review and practice that. Here's another review that you could kind of pause and see if you could name and identify the different parts of the skull, the different parts of the skeleton. Yeah, so the more you do, the more review that you do, the better. So Schoology quiz also will give you a review. So the purpose of today's screencast is to talk about joints. So joints are where different bones come together. Things like your knee, your elbow, these are common joints. The general principle here is that stability is inversely related to the range of motion. So believe it or not, I actually created this graphic all by myself using some basic tools in Google Slideshow here. But you can think of it like a teeter-totter here. As stability goes up, range of motion will go down. I'm doing it kind of backwards here. And then as range of motion goes up, then you lose out on stability. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at some different types of joints to explore this a little bit. So fibrous joints are the first type of joint, and fibrous joints are actually immovable. You can't move them at all, and the bones are linked by fibrous connective tissue. So where can you think of two bones that come together but they don't move at all? Did you say skull? Because you're right, the skull. The sutures of the skull are an example of this. So every junction of two colors is a fibrous joint. So on our little teeter-totter here, obviously the skull has extraordinarily high stability, but pretty much zero range of motion, which is good. That's what we want for the skull because its main job is to protect the brain. So we want it stable. We don't want it moving. All is well. The next type of joint are cartilaginous joints. These are slightly movable, and the bones are linked by cartilage. There's a number of places where you find these in the body. Your rib cage has cartilaginous joints where the rib meets the sternum. That's what allows your chest to expand as you breathe. The pelvis, we kind of talked about how during childbirth that pelvis kind of flexes out ever so slightly to expand the opening here for the baby to come out. In between your vertebrae, you've got these cartilaginous discs, and that's what allows you to kind of bend your back and do the worm and other amazing breakdancing moves. So these are cartilaginous, and so still pretty high on stability, still pretty low on range of motion, not to the extent of the skull, but overall still kind of in the stable over range of motion camp. The last type of joint then are synovial joints. These are a little bit complicated. So here we have two bones. You can imagine that this is the upper leg bone and this is the lower leg bone. So this would be like your knee joint. But the bones are enclosed by this capsule. So there's this little, all the way around, there's this little capsule of connective tissue. And then that capsule is filled with what is called synovial fluid. This is pretty much if I say the word joint, unless you're addicted to drugs, whatever pops in your head is probably a synovial joint. So your fingers, your knee, your shoulders, your hips, all those are synovial joints. These are the most common. And then the stability range of motion thing varies. So for example, your upper arm, I'm gonna try and do this on the little screen in the corner here, but your humerus, where it connects to the shoulder, has huge range of motion. Just kind of spin it back and forth all over the place. Huge range of motion there, but it's not very stable. You may have heard that dislocating your shoulder is actually fairly common. And that's because it just isn't very stable. If you look at the model of a skeleton in a classroom, you'll find that they have to tie strings to keep the arm bone attached to the shoulder. So it's really held in place by muscles and tendons and ligaments and things like that. Not very stable, but that means huge range of motion, which is kind of useful for us. Your hip bone, on the other hand, if you try and take your leg and do this motion, you won't be able to. And that's because there's less range of motion, but it makes your legs more stable. So, you could do that exercise for all of them, but that just kind of highlights the different examples. So, you can categorize these synovial joints as different types. There's ball and socket, which is like your arm bone connecting to your shoulder, the humerus and the scapula. There's a pivot joint, so your radius and ulna, if you just take your arm, I'm trying to get the screen here, it's kind of tricky here. But if you take your arm and just kind of rotate, palm up, palm down like that, that's a pivot joint. And what's happening is the head of the radius is rotating about the ulna. It just kind of rolls over, so it pivots back and forth as you rotate your forearm, palm up, palm down. A hinge joint is basically just like your knee or your elbow. It kind of bends up, bends down, bends up, bends down. It's a hinge. And then you have a number of other types where your fingers and wrists come in. I'm not going to worry too much about these types, but your fingers, for example, they're not quite hinged because you can kind of move them sideways like that and do some other things, but they're not quite ball and socket either. So that's what these other categories are for. Gliding is these little bones in your wrist that glide past one another as you move, etc. Here's a little video. You can click on that on your own at some point. Why do joints pop? And that's kind of interesting. Spoiler alert, it's not harmful to pop your joints typically. What I want to focus on today is things that can damage your joints and what we do about that. So the first thing that can cause damage to your joints is arthritis. And what arthritis is it's a general term for over 100 conditions that damage the joints. And what all these different conditions have in common is there's going to be pain, inflammation, and swelling at the joint. So two common examples of arthritis, two common types. The first is osteoarthritis. This is probably what you think of when you hear the word arthritis. So this is experienced typically by older people, and it's just caused by years of compression that cause the joint to soften and erode. So you'll look at this. Here's your synovial joint. You can see that synovial fluid in between the two bones. You can see a nice healthy articular cartilage on the ends of those bones, that cartilage cap that we talked about earlier. All seems well, but then here, the compression has caused the articular cartilage to wear away, and the bones are now rubbing, which is not good. Rheumatoid arthritis is another type. This is totally different. This is caused by an autoimmune disorder, which means your immune cells are, for reasons no one fully understands, attacking your own body's cells. And in this case, they're attacking the cells, kind of highlighted by this yellow color, that create the synovial fluid. So by attacking those cells, it causes an inflammation, and that causes swelling and pain. Rheumatoid arthritis, by the way, can hit at any age, and it's quite debilitatingly painful, and it kind of ebbs and flows over time. So you might be fine for a while, and then you kind of get this little attack, and then you experience intense pain for a while, and then it goes away. I've had students who had to stay home from school for a number of days because the pain is so substantial. So kind of a bummer. What are the effects then of arthritis? Well, if the bones are rubbing against each other, that can be problematic, obviously. One thing it can cause is bone spurs. And, here you can see these kind of swollen areas around the joints at the knuckles, and you can see that here. What's going on? Well, you can imagine if the bones are rubbing against each other, that causes little microscopic fractures. And if you recall, when we talked about broken bones, we said that when a bone is healed, it kind of overcompensates to protect the bone in the future and makes it bigger and bulkier. And so basically, as you're going and causing this damage, well, then your body's like, oh, I better repair that damage. So it builds up more bone, but then that causes more scraping, which then causes more bone, and it kind of creates this runaway process where you get this this kind of buildup of bone. And then that starts to pinch nerves or tendons and can be very problematic and painful. Another effect is you can just totally destroy an entire joint. So, here's a nice healthy knee joint, and then here's one that's damaged by arthritis. So the articular cartilage is worn away. You can see the bone is kind of damaged down here. The meniscus, that's this little flat cartilaginous structure here, is kind of gone in this one. Here's a damaged hip joint. And so what do you do about that? Well, sometimes you'll actually have to replace the entire joint. So how do you do that? If you have a hip replacement, what's going on there? Here is a typical healthy hip. Let's go ahead and give them arthritis. Ready? Just like that. There's an arthritic joint. So healthy, arthritic, healthy, arthritic. And so what they'll do to replace it is they just take the whole joint out. So they literally have to kind of pop the joint out. So sort of like popping it out of the socket. And then they use a saw to slice off that damaged head of the femur. And then they grind out the acetabulum is what it's called, that little socket there in the hip. And then they use metal to replace it. So they screw in this metal socket, and then they pound this artificial head down in there. And you might wonder, well, how do they get it in the middle of the bone? Well, remember, the bone in the middle is hollow. It's got that medullary cavity. So you pound that in there. Yes, the yellow bone marrow that's in there is going to be lost, but that's just fat. And hey, this is America, man. We got plenty of that, so we're fine. We don't need to worry about the fat. So we just pound that in there, and then you kind of reassemble, and that is what an artificial hip looks like. Another way to damage joints is a sprain. A sprain is simply a stretched or torn ligament. So remember, a ligament connects bone to bone, and so stretching or tearing that causes that. So here you have the ligaments of your ankle, and you can see if you roll the ankle, type 1 is where you're kind of stretching that out. Type 2 is a partial tear. Type 3 is a complete. Watch, I'll make a little cartoon. Woo, whoa, woo, whoa. And so the problem with these is they take an enormously long time to heal. And the reason why comes back to what we talked about earlier in the year. Fibrous connective tissue is what makes up ligaments, and the cells are few and far between. We kind of made the analogy like a rural setting where you've got a little house and then a whole lot of land, nothing there, and then another house. So because of this, the cells that are supposed to repair the damage are spaced really far apart. There's a low blood supply because the cells are spaced far apart. And so then it's just going to take a while for the healing process to work because you just don't have many cells and much nutrients and oxygen and whatnot to fix it. So sprains are kind of a pain. The ACL injury is kind of a common sprain. The ACL stands for anterior cruciate ligament, which is this one right here. It connects to the front of the tibia and then the back of the fibula. Cruciate, by the way, means cross because it kind of makes an X. And so, the reason that the ACL is so frequently injured is it's relatively weak. Its job is to kind of prevent the knee from sliding forward. But you can imagine it's this hinge joint, right? So at your knee, it's supposed to be hinging like this. But in football, soccer, these kinds of games, there's a lot of like you plant your foot and then you twist and you kind of like you put a twisting strain on that ACL. So if you plant and twist, you're sort of asking this hinge joint to do something weird, and it can oftentimes get torn in the process. So to deal with that, if it's minor, they can just immobilize it and hope it can heal itself. If it's major, they might have to remove the entire ligament. So to do that, they'll actually drill holes in the bone, and they'll take a artificial ligament. Either they'll pull some ligament material from your own knee or from other parts of your body, or they might get a cadaver one, which is just from a dead body, and they just kind of run it through those holes that they made, and they just replace that in there. They screw it in and replace it. So the final damage to joint is a dislocation. A dislocation is where bones are forced out of their normal positions at the joint, and so you can see that. Ooh, that's not good, and you can see that there as well. A common dislocation to be aware of is in little children, where the radius attaches is fairly weak. And so if you're babysitting somebody and you're doing those games, you like swing them around by their arms, or they're sort of running up your chest and you flip them, all these things, or swinging them, between two adults, all those things put stress on that, and you can dislocate it, which, if you're getting paid, $10, $15 an hour to watch somebody's kid, you probably don't want to dislocate their arm, right? So it's not good for your income stream. So so be careful with other people's children, I guess, right? So that's it for joints, and actually that's it for the skeletal system. So up next is muscles. Thank you.